Good afternoon. My name's Iris Wilbur-Glick, and I'm president of the Louisville Forum. Welcome to our May meeting. We typically meet on the second Wednesday of each month at Vincenzo's Restaurant in downtown Louisville, and all are welcome. Founded in 1984, the Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group that hosts debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our programs, or to make a reservation, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Today's program: Violence in Louisville, TV coverage, impact, and responsibility. With the recent tragedies happening right here in our community and across the nation, there are nearly daily headlines about violent crimes and the devastating damage it leaves behind. Communities and families changed forever. How a community reacts, responds, heals, or endures stems from many circumstances, but I think we can all agree that media, particularly TV coverage and journalism, plays an important role in how we all process information. The responsibility of getting the story right weighs heavily on journalists. The right information, the right tone. Are we talking about just accuracy? Are we talking about compelling storytelling that drives action? Or maybe both? Is it possible to change hearts and minds by delivering the news? That's what we are talking about today. Today, we have an esteemed panel of TV media professionals here to share their experiences and perspectives about violent crime coverage in our town. First up, we have John Bull. He's an anchor and investigative reporter of WAVE. Jennifer Keeney, news director of WDRB. Steve Duncan, assignment manager of WHAS, and Dalton Godby, reporter with WDRB. Because of a miscommunication, WLKY is not represented on the panel, but we have folks with us today from WLKY News Director Andrea Stallman and Community Affairs Director Debbie Robertson are with us, and we welcome and thank you for joining us today. Our very own Lawrence Smith, board member of Louisville Forum and communications director for the Kentucky Baptist Convention, will serve as today's moderator. Lawrence has more than 40 years of journalism and media experience. Most recently was an Emmy-winning political reporter at WDRB. So thank you, Lawrence, for taking on today's task. Please join me in welcoming our featured speakers and moderator.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I would think it's safe to say that there is a combined more than 100 years experience in Louisville television on this panel. And if you add me to it, it goes way up. But I'm glad you're all here. Let's get started. I want to first get a sense of how a newsroom operates during a crisis. Steve, take us back 1 month ago to April 10th. What was your first indication there was something very wrong? And take us through the process of getting coverage to the scene.
Well, it was interesting because when the shooting actually occurred, I wasn't actually at the station yet. And I found out that there was an active shooter alert after I stepped out of the shower. And that's when it hits you, that this could be something big. And then, of course, I'm communicating with people on the way down to the station. We did have people that were dispatched immediately to the shooting scene. And from there, there's so many different angles that start developing. People being taken to the hospital. We had a crew that went there. Obviously, like I said, people at the scene. Eventually, information's coming out on a shooter and who he was and where he could have been from. And we ended up with a crew that went to his house. So there are just a number of different locations that start unfolding in front of you, and you're eventually continuing to regroup and regather, exchange information, and make decisions on the fly as far as where you need to go and where you need additional crews.
But the first thing is to get people there, wherever there is, right?
Right.
Jennifer, this happened during the morning show. You were still on the air. Talk about the decisions that you need to make to cover the story and the decision to stay on the air past the usual ending time for these shows.
Yeah, I was in the newsroom when it happened. I just gotten back. It was spring break the week before, so I'd been back for a total of like 40 minutes, and we had heard on the scanners, we knew right away that something was different. You hear a lot of things on the scanners, but this one was different. When you hear active shooter, we knew that something was happening. So Dalton and our chief photographer were both in the newsroom, and we're just grab all your stuff and go. And they know the drill. They don't ask questions. They just, all right, where is it? So they headed out. As additional crews came in, we sent them. Our morning show is on the air, so we know something's happening, but it's not confirmed. When we hear things on scanners, we can't report information unless we get it from sources on the scene who can tell us what's happening, or police officials who can confirm that something's happening. So once Dalton and Zach got there, we got a live shot up, and we knew, once again, there were police cars stretching blocks and huge rescue vehicles and buses full of, tactical gear and people coming out. So we knew this was something. So we took a live shot. We had our anchors, Candace and Sterling, speak about what was happening. We started going to Dalton once he kind of got his wits about him and could get enough information to talk to it. And again, we didn't have anything confirmed. You just talk about what you see. And so we knew we couldn't go off the air. We knew something was happening. Behind the scenes, we knew there was a shooter, that there were multiple fatalities, that the shooter was down, and that a police officer had been shot. So then you have to make the decisions of when you can report what, and those happen throughout the day.
Dalton, you were one of the first on the scene. Talk about what it was like there. How do you gather information and report information really in real time?
I think that's the difficult thing at any breaking news scene, whether it's a shooting or some other sort of homicide. When you get there, oftentimes assignment editors are sending you with not a lot of knowledge. It's only scanner information that we know at the moment. And again, we choose not to report that until we can get things confirmed. So I think it's a duty of reporters to have boots on the ground and be there talking to the people who are in that area to find out what's true, what's false, the things that are being said, do they hold any weight? And when you're in a situation like that, and I certainly have never been in any sort of chaotic situation like what we saw at Old National Bank a month ago, and having to compose yourself and know that there are people out there relying on your reporting, on your station's coverage of an event that is clearly going to impact our city in a significant way. It's important to talk to the people and get the information that is available and that you know is accurate. And a lot of that, I will say, comes from things that we learn from the newsroom. It's communication constantly with the folks back working behind the scenes to try and confirm those details, and combining those with the information that I'm gathering from whether it be an employee who has ran out of the bank past the police barricade or the police themselves on the scene. It's combining those facts, those details, setting the scene for our viewers and telling them the things that they need to know right away. And I think along with that, it's important not necessarily to be the first to report that, but to be accurate in that reporting, whether that happens to come first or last. The accuracy is the most important thing.
John, all the stations pretty much were on the air with this all day. How do you keep, as an anchor, the information coming sometimes when there's no new information to give?
Yeah, I was on air from 12 to 8 hours straight. Wave never went off the air. And fortunately for us, we have a safety and security expert, Sean Johnson, former LMPD, that we use a lot. And he was in already on set and bounced things off of him. And we're always told, and I believe this by the consultants, an anchor's job is to bring value beyond the content. You need to take it to another level other than just reporting what's going on here and there. And so I revert into a real person when I'm in those situations. And I ask the things that the person watching, I think, is thinking. And so we did a lot of live interviews and bounced things off of Deshaun because he was immensely qualified in that situation. He had responded to Standard Gravure massacre. He was a cop. He's a safety and security expert. He could answer many of the questions that I think were on people's minds, even though information was coming in slowly.
Talk about that. You want to be a steadying influence, but at the same time, I'm noticing in all the coverage that people are not really holding back their emotions. Talk about how you manage that.
Well, first of all, I'll set this up with, I always used to think there was something wrong with me, that things didn't get to me, like 9/11 and things didn't bother me as much as other people, and I thought there's something wrong with me. But this particular time, I had to seek counseling. I was breaking down during the week when the body cam video came out, and multiple times in the week, and I had to end up at the end of that week seeking counseling. But I'll tell you an interesting story about how you go through the day and do your job. In the middle of our coverage, I got contacted by a Washington Post reporter who said he was monitoring the coverage and he wanted to interview me. And I said, I'll do it after I get off the air. And so at 8 o'clock, I called him and he said, you say things as an anchor I don't hear a lot of anchors say. And I said, like what? And he said, well, for instance, you were interviewing Morgan McGarvey and you said, Morgan, when I take my lunch break, I drive past 3 shot spotters, and we can't even have a mass shooting here without the cops having to run down the street for another homicide. I said, this is a really scary place to live in many different ways. And anyway, he read that back to me because he had recorded that, and I said, yeah? And he said, why'd you say that? And I said, because it's true. Like, that's my job as a news anchor, to talk about the things that are on people's minds, So I just try to conduct my business and answer the questions that people are thinking as they're watching.
Dalton, you're on the scene. How do you manage the emotions you're experiencing with, I guess, also wanting to be a steady influence, but you also didn't really try to mask what you were feeling out there?
No, and I've had several conversations after the fact with whether it be friends or coworkers about that exact same thing. And as John said, it's important to be a human being. The old ways of TV news, of a reporter standing in front of a camera and just giving facts are going away. And our viewers, we're finding, are seeking humans to be on television and relate to them. And I think that's very important for us to realize and to do in our jobs. And one of the things that I think has helped me cope with what happened and deal mentally and emotionally with what was going on is just to say out loud the things that I was feeling in our coverage. I got a unique opportunity to be there as things were happening and tell our viewers how I was experiencing it and the things that I was thinking about and the things that I was feeling. And I think looking back on that, it allowed me to vocalize those things instead of hold them in internally. And I think it really helped me to be able to process that and understand the magnitude of what was happening. And in turn, I think it allowed viewers to relate to this situation and to understand that what we saw happening and what was playing out in front of our eyes and their eyes has an impact on everybody in this community and even people outside of this community. And I think folks like John and reporters from other TV stations and anchors elsewhere did a really great job of being able to have that human element and showing our viewers that we do have empathy in situations like these. And I think that's very important and has never been more important than the situation that we were in that day.
I'm going to come back to Old National, but I want to expand this discussion for a moment into how decisions are made. This violence rightly received wall-to-wall coverage, but the mass shooting at Chickasaw Park did not receive that kind of coverage. Talk about why there was a difference in the coverage there and the coverage of the Old National shooting? Jennifer, I'll start with you.
Well, one thing I think is the easy answer is it's access. With Chickasaw, I have to applaud Mayor Greenberg and Assistant Chief Humphreys, who came out to the scene on Chickasaw that night. It happened at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. They came to the scene. They made themselves accessible. But the difference is at the bank, there were a lot of people who would come and talk to us afterward. At Chickasaw, in fact, we just did a story. Police are begging us to put out stories. Hey, there were hundreds of people in the park at the time. You saw something. Please come talk to us. So a lot of times, just access. In the Old National Bank shooting, we could get some witness information. We could see what was happening with our own eyes. With Chickasaw, that wasn't the case. We relied on officials to tell us things, and officials clearly don't give us information a lot. There's only things that they can tell us. So that has a lot to do with it. I can tell you we had discussions in our newsroom of that very fact of, hey, you have two very similar violent incidents that are tragic to people who live in our community, but in very different parts of the community that respond in different ways. So how can we be fair to make sure that the victims of one tragedy are treated the same way as victims of the other tragedy? And sometimes it's just the logistics that make it really tough to cover things fairly. But I can tell you there are a lot of discussions happening behind the scenes to make sure that we are giving equal treatment to equal tragedy, as terrible as that sounds.
Steve, same question.
I think that with Old National, part of it was just that it happened when it did, which was right at the beginning of a work day, and where it did, which was right in downtown Louisville. I don't think that there's a lot of decisions that are made based on whether we're going to go wall to wall or not. That comes kind of later. I think your first instinct is just to get the story covered, get people out there, get information out there, and whether we stick with it and break into programming, that's a bigger decision that really has to do with whether there's a lot more information to still dispense to the public. And I think that's what happened with the Old National.
John, you're one of the few reporters who were around, have been around for a long time, and have seen these types of shooting. How is coverage, Steve, of course, you have been around for a while too. How has the coverage of this type of thing changed over the years?
Okay, so in 1989, what was it, September 14th? And this is interesting because just a couple of years ago on the 30th anniversary of the Standard Reviewer shooting, I did a massive, comprehensive two-part look back. I had got to several of the survivors who had gone 30 years where they couldn't talk, and it was unbelievable. Part one was about the PTSD effects down the road on these people, and then part two, we got the case file. And so I was able to look at all the things we didn't know before. And a couple things stood out to me as I was putting it together, and I pointed out in the stories as well. One of them was, when I was looking back at our coverage back then, we were running the same exact sound bites that we're running today on the guns argument. Literally, you got the gun shop owner standing there saying, I don't know why people blame these things for personal problems. And then you had the victims' families saying, why in the world should a citizen be allowed to own an assault rifle, right? So we had that, and I dredged those up and put those back in because we hear them every single mass shooting now today. The other thing that stood out that I thought was really fascinating, and I did a number of stories on this as it was unfolding over the years when I was at WLKY, and I wrote about it in my book as well, but I found it fascinating that two people came out of the Standard Revere massacre with completely opposite views on guns. Mike Campbell shot 6 times, went on a crusade across the country, was on the Donahue Show and all those shows, talking, we need to get rid of assault weapons. How in the world is this allowed? Blah, blah, blah. And then Jackie Miller shot 4 times, had her wheelchair, in a wheelchair, had her wheelchair plastered in NRA stickers. And she would go and speak. And her position was also compelling. Her point was, I had a gun in my purse. I was the second of 20 people shot. I was reaching into my purse, about to grab my gun, and I could have saved 18 other people from getting shot. You know, we need to have weapons kind of perspective. And so it was fascinating that two different people, shot a total of 10 times, came out of that ordeal with completely opposite views on gun control. And to answer your question then, what has changed? Same thing that's happening today.
Question from the audience. And this is a good question, especially when you're doing follow-up stories or pursuing information that may not be confirmed by police. Where do you cross the line in terms of privacy? As I recall, I know WDRB for sure, maybe the other stations as well, got some indication of who the shooter was and went to his home before his name was released. Where's the line as far as privacy is concerned? Jennifer, I'll start with you there.
It's a tough one. It really is. But I think there are a lot of conversations in our newsroom happening about, especially when it happens in your own backyard, we know that these are our friends and our family, and eventually somebody is going to know somebody who is directly impacted by this. We never want anybody to find anything out from us. They should hear awful news about their lives from the people they love, not from the TV stations or the websites that they go to. We had a lot of information. We knew who the shooter was pretty quickly, and we didn't put anything out there. We knew who some of the victims were pretty quickly. We didn't put any of that information out there. So you really have to balance a lot of that. We did go to the shooter's house because there was a search warrant executed there. So there was an active scene happening. We did have discussions, too, about keeping it wide and which house it was and who you talked to. So we are very, very careful about what we can put out there because, you know, the number one, you know, the baseline of journalism is do no harm. And so that was in the back of our heads the entire time of making sure, as Dalton said, you don't want to be first, you want to be right, and you want to be compassionate.
Steve, same question for you. How do you balance that privacy versus getting information out there?
I was going to say the same thing about how quickly information gets out there or that gets to you as far as people that are involved. I was looking at my notes from that morning or from that day, and we had his name by noon and where he supposedly lived. We had one address in southern Indiana, one address that turned out to be the correct one. And it is something that we think about, but initially we're responding to where the story leads us to. And in this case, we had information that there were quite a few law enforcement that were at this scene, which was his house. And so we needed to at least get there and see what was going on. And but as far as releasing the information, that's certainly we had plenty of names, the victims well ahead of time, and we're chasing those leads down, trying to get confirmation. The most important thing is not releasing information too soon, and certainly before it's verified and confirmed. And that's what we were doing that morning.
Dalton, question, I'll direct this to you, and this is along the same lines. You're gathering information that the public wants to know, but how do you be sensitive to the fact that people are going through a very traumatic experience?
You know, I think, and this kind of goes back to the last question as well. I think for newsrooms, whether that be WDRB or any of the other stations, these things are a case-by-case basis. There is no protocol for how to respond to a mass shooting in your community. These things have to be discussed, and there's a large part of the news business where we have to react right away to these things. We have to get out on scene, and that is when we have to make the decisions that really impact our coverage. And I think those conversations were happening from the time that our assignment editor, Chris Turner, sent me out the door until the time we went off, actually probably are still happening today. And I think as you are delivering that news, the empathy that you share, I think, comes across to our viewers as compassionate and caring. And I had people reach out to me. I know other reporters who were on the scene that day who, tried everything in their voice and tone to strike that same appeal to our viewers. And many of them reached out and said, it felt like you were talking directly to me. It felt like you understood what I was going through or experiencing. And I go back to something I said earlier when mentioning just describing the way that I was feeling and the atmosphere that was happening around me not only allowed myself to process that better, but I think helped our viewers and helped our audience to understand that for themselves, that feeling that was happening within themselves. And so, not every story that reporters respond to or get called on the scene to, strike that same sort of atmosphere or environment. And that's why I say it's a case-by-case situation that we have to deal with. And we have to know, as journalists, as anchors, as reporters, as news directors or assignment editors, how do we do our job the best way possible in this environment, in this situation, and make sure that our audience relates to that?
Another question from our audience. Other than access issues, how, if you would address the coverage of an interest in gun violence, specifically in the West and South End. I think there's a concern that, let me put it this way, because this is a question I wanted to ask. We get a lot of the who, what, when, where, not a lot of the why. Talk about how you address those kinds of issues as far as the why of this is happening. And as this person has asked, there's a lack of interest sometimes. There's so much. Does interest wane? Steve, talk about that aspect of the story. I hope that question, that convoluted question, makes sense.
Yeah, that's something that is a part of every one of our editorial meetings. We have 2 a day, and that's the question with any story that we're considering putting somebody on, and that is, what do people want to know? Why do people want to know this story? Sometimes story may not be the most important topic, but it might be the most interesting. And so we're looking for why somebody would want to watch this story and need this information. And when you're talking about the gun violence situation, which has obviously just skyrocketed over the last probably 5 years, 6 years, it's something that's hard to pin down. And I think a lot of people have become numb to it. And that's a terrible situation for us as a community to be in. I speak with people with ABC every day, and they're in New York City, and they're in disbelief, at what's going on in this city. Not that it's not going on everywhere, but it just, they don't perceive that Louisville as a city where this kind of violence would be at this point.
John, pick up on that. There are so many shootings, not all mass shootings, but every other day there's a shooting of some kind in Louisville. Talk about how you cover it in such a way that the community does not become numb to it, or is that even possible?
Well, I mean, anybody who sees my work knows that I get out there. I embed myself in neighborhoods. I follow up on complaints about drug houses and things like that, and even above a preacher's house, owned by a preacher, I should say. I travel with security now when I go do interviews. And a lot of people come at me sometimes like, yeah, you're only in the West End making it look bad. No, I'm responding to complaints from the West End, complaints about police not doing things about drug houses. Even one of the last ones I did in this past year was I was videotaping a flourishing drug house with like 30, 40 customers an hour, videotaping from the police substation parking lot, and then trying to get answers. I mean, that's our job as journalists, is to go out and try to find out the why and to try to get answers. I've had I take risks because it's important. People say, why in the world do you do that? Because it's important to people, the people calling. Can't have the kids play out in the street. I've had my house graffitied up with death threats. 72-hour police guard when I was at LKY in like 2009-ish or so. but I keep doing it because it's important to people. It's our job.
Jennifer, talk about the why issue, the coverage of the why issue, covering this in such a way that people don't become numb to it, but actually care about what's going on.
Well, and I was having this conversation, James kind of came up to us beforehand and was asking about that. It's not just about each individual incident that happens, but getting to the root of the problem. We actually did a half-hour special the Thursday after the Chickasaw Park shooting and we brought in Reverend Kevin Cosby from St. Stephen Baptist Church, some people who are in the community trying to change things, giving opportunities for young people who a lot of times their opportunity is to get involved in crime, and instead they're giving them opportunities to do positive things within their community. So you really kind of have to get to the why of the community and why a lot of times, the West End violence is happening because this is a community that doesn't have a grocery store. It doesn't have the resources that the rest of this community has. So doing those kinds of stories to say, hey, there is a disparity here. There are, a lot of resources that a lot of us have that it's just not opportunities that kids growing up could even dream of having. So it's really important to point out all those kinds of things because unless you make those changes, we're not going to see any changes on the crime.
An audience member wants to know the station's policy on showing video of wounded or those who have passed away. How much do you show, and how do you make those decisions? Steve, I'll start with you.
We don't show that, and that's something that has changed over the years. Every once in a while, we'll have to go down in our archives and pull a story that we covered, back in the 80s or something like that. And I'll tell you what it was. It was the Cocaine Bear story with the movie. And we pulled some of the file from when the original incident happened. And I mean, we were showing the guy that parachuted out of the plane and everything. He was laying there on a gurney, his body dead as a doornail, and it was just on TV. And, it's wild to think that, we were showing that and nobody was complaining or anything back then. And now, we don't want to show anything like that. And as a matter of fact, there's even decision making that goes into if we get sound of gunshots going off, maybe it's shown once and an initial time, and then after that, we don't show that anymore or allow the sound anymore. So it's something that's a very sensitive nature, and it's something we think about and take seriously.
I assume you all have similar policies regarding what you show and what you don't?
Yes, I don't think anybody wants to see that, especially a lot of times you got your TV on, your kids are running around in the house, and you don't want to do anything that's going to traumatize people more than they already are. So there's not really a benefit out of it, right? We all understand what violence looks like. I will tell you one of the things that we ran into on the day of the old National Bank shooting was the next day police released body cam video from one of the officers, and they were doing a press conference and they were releasing it live. And we knew that Officer Wilt, the first thing that happens is he's shot as he tries to approach. And so we had a lot of discussions in our newsroom this is an important story. Do we take it live? We know there's a lot of interest. Or is this something that we hold back on? HAS decided not to take that press conference live. We were assured by LMPD that you would not see anything that would be disturbing to viewers, that would kind of show that Wilt's partner was trying to get to him and just kept coming under fire. And, there were a lot of us in the newsroom and in the control room that day, with our hands over our mouths and seeing this poor man who was helpless to do anything to help his partner who was on his fourth day on the job. So we know that these are traumatic experiences, and we never want to, create more trauma for people who are already experiencing it.
If I could just jump in, we asked them, the police, that day before they released it, we asked if we could come over there and see the video first, and they wouldn't let us do it. And so we were convinced that if we took it live, that we were going to show video of somebody getting shot in the head or in the face or something like that. So that's exactly why we chose not to do that. We did not know they were going to blur the faces and stuff, but we felt good about making that decision and would certainly do the same thing again.
We had a long talk as well at WAVE about it, and we decided, I thought they had a pretty good idea to back everything up on a 7-second delay. So we were literally had somebody on the trigger to hit it and punch out and come back to the anchors if something did happen. But it was extremely well put together, and I would submit one of the most powerful things I've ever seen in local news in my whole life.
This question from the audience asks you to explain what the question believes is the disparity in coverage of how you cover the shooter and the victim depending on the person's race. In other words, do you believe that the coverage of the bank shooter may have been different from the coverage of another shooter in the West End, for example, who may have been of a different race? Answer that question. Is that a consideration at all in your coverage?
I can tell you that we've had a lot of discussions about not using the shooter's name at all, and in fact, we don't. At first, of course, there's interest in who this person was and what would prompt somebody to do something so terrible. And once that initial information came out, we made the decision to just refer to him as the shooter. Then there was a letter that was released. He left the 12-page note talking about why he did it, and it was so he could show mental illness and the ease of purchasing guns. And it was CNN reported on it, the Daily Mail reported on it, and we are a CNN affiliate. We have access to that information. We chose not to use it because we heard from our sources that that's everything they're reporting isn't necessarily accurate. And also, we were having discussions in the newsroom of this is exactly what this person who committed a horrible act wanted. Do we need to be the vehicle for getting his message out to the world? And so we decided not to do anything on that. Now, I'm sure there's going to be more stories, and as the investigation continues, and we'll have to make decisions on a case-by-case basis. But for us, the coverage should be of the victims, not of the aggressors, unless we're talking, as I said earlier, about what the repercussions are, with the judicial system, that if you act in a way, if you break the law, there's going to be consequences. We think that's important too.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Is there a difference in coverage depending on the race of either the shooter or the victims?
I mean, I don't think that makes a difference at all. I do think that there is interest in the viewers as about someone that would do this, and there's a big why with that. And but as far as our decision making based on someone's race or ethnicity, that doesn't come into play. I do think that there are times when if you look into a person's criminal background history, I think that is of interest to people if we find someone that has committed a crime and has done it before, whether it's a DUI, whether it's a domestic violence, even homicide. I think that adds to the story if we know that it wasn't just a one-time thing.
I had a real learning experience a few years ago. WLOU had on me and had on Stefan to take calls about it right in the height of that particular violence crisis. And one of the points brought up by the callers I thought was really, really interesting and true for the most part. And that was they were very, very upset because they alleged that the local media here, when there's a homicide on the west side, that we oftentimes just call it a murder. Someone was murdered. And that when it happens on the east side, that we call it a homicide. It's very important. That's a journalistic lesson anyway. They're all homicides. A murder is a designation down the road that a jury may or may not come to. Now, I don't know about the allegation of we only do it one way on the west side versus the east side, but I thought there's something to that, and I've tried to share that with all the people in the newsroom. I think the reason that question was asked, I want to share an observation I had over the course of about 3 weeks that was horrifying to me about the state of our media in our country. There was a span where there were about, I have a little TV on next to my desk in the evening in between the 6 and the 11, and there were 3 different mass shooting kind of things unfolding, perfect for cable news. And I thought it was fascinating as I was flipping around between CNN, MSNBC, and Fox, that the first couple were right-wing extremist types, and CNN and MSNBC were wall-to-wall, like for hours, and Fox was barely hitting it. And then the next one was, there was a guy going around, you may remember, in Memphis, driving around, shooting people, live streaming it, and uncatchable, just going around shooting people, live streaming it, a black man. And MSNBC and CNN were nowhere to be found as I kept flipping back and forth, and Fox was wall to wall and had a split screen of this black man's mugshot up there covering it. It was horrifying to me, but that is where we've come in many cases as a society. So that's why people are asking questions like that.
Dalton, talk about follow-up stories. How are decisions made regarding how to follow up a story, and how long do you keep the follow-ups going? How long do you keep the story fresh, in other words?
Well, I think every day there's a conversation, whether it be about follow-up stories to this big story or really to any of our coverage, is what is the newsworthy value of this idea or this thing that is being brought to the table. So I think you have to ask, what impact does this have on our viewers? Is it important to do a follow-up story in the days after about the background of this shooter and about the life that he lived leading up to this horrible accident? What is the newsworthy value of that, and what impact are you making? What kind of statement are you making with doing a story like that versus doing a story on the lives of the victims who were lost in this tragedy? And I think as newsrooms grow and as we find ourselves in these situations more and more, I'm noticing, especially in our newsroom, these conversations are happening in different ways with each story, and they're happening differently. And so when you take a story of national attention such as this one, it's important to realize that this story may not be broadcast just to the viewers in Louisville and the viewers in our DMA, and that's what we call the folks who are in our area that get the station. But this, with national attention, can be reaching audiences around the world. And I think you have to think about what kind of tone that you strike in the follow-up stories, whether it be with a shooting of national attention or a shooting in the west or east or south or ends or downtown. And again, I know that we keep saying case by case and story by story, but it truly is one of those things that we have to think about, and we have to have those conversations every time to make sure that we are making the right decisions.
John, you mentioned earlier some of the stories that you've covered. You've had to have security guards with you. You mentioned what's happened to your house. Jennifer, and I'll let you comment as well. What instructions do you give your crews when they're going to a violent scene? And what are the safety concerns, especially now in what seems to be more, chaotic and emotional situations? How do you keep your crews safe?
I think that's why you've seen a lot of people leave local journalism. I've often said 2020 was it was a tough year for local journalism. A lot of us live in this city. We love this city. We came to report on local news, and we became a team of war correspondents for months. And that's not what people signed up for. They were out, with protesters every night and guns and tear gas and bullets fired. It was a scary time. So we lost a lot of people then. I always say that the people who are still with it, they really love what they do. They feel a duty to do this. I feel a duty to keep them all safe. These aren't just my employees. These are, people. This is my work family. It sounds cliche, but I truly care about every single person there. We also have hired security. That was common practice during 2020. We hired security the day of the bank shooting just because we didn't know. So just as a safety precaution, we had them out there. They didn't have much to do. I remember our assistant news director running up to Zach and Dalton as they were going out the door and, you got all this, you got this, you got this. And they're like, be safe. We really have to rely on them to be, environmentally aware, to know, and they have instructions. If you pull up on a scene and you don't feel safe, just keep going. You don't need to ask permission. You don't need to explain why. Get out. And it's a shame to me that this is our community and this is the way that it is. I'll tell you, a lot of times after there is a homicide, there's a lot of emotion happening, and those are probably some of the toughest time to be there, because family sees, a news car roll up, and the last thing they want is a camera out shooting the worst day of their life. So we take those kinds of things into consideration as well.
Steve, policies, how do you keep your crews safe?
Well, we did the same thing as well with hired security. But another event, fairly recent event that happened, it really changed our coverage. And that was the shooting down in Florida with the crew that was shot. And they were on a scene. Police were there and everything. And it just really opened our eyes as to our crew, not taking for granted that you're safe at a scene, even if police are there. And we've made some decisions about whether we're going to send just an individual person to a shooting scene or an unsecured scene, certainly. But even if you've got a staging area that's set up with police, having an area for the media to respond to, you never know what's going to happen. And we take that very seriously. And we've changed some of the ways that we go on just a regular routine story. And we would go and do what these guys all do all the time, which is a door knock, where you're going and knocking on the door and trying to, try to get an interview or something like that. We won't do it anymore. It's not, it's not worth putting our crew in an unsafe situation, so we just don't do it.
John, having been in the field myself, when you're out there covering a story, you kind of get tunnel vision, and sometimes you're not aware of the actual danger you may be in. How aware are you of that, and what's consideration when you're in the field, and Dalton, when you're in the field, of the possible danger that you may be in? My
awareness level amped up significantly after one night during the protests when one of our security guards came back, and he showed me how he would take his phone and he would just record video the entire time. So for hours, as they're walking and doing their job, he's just like doing like this with his phone. And he comes back and he shows me, you could hear gunshots clipping the branches above their head. Anybody who's ever hunted before knows the difference between like a close gunshot and what. And you could clearly hear bullets ripping right above their head, multiple. And I thought, wow, But I'll also say, I just had an interesting discussion with my two daughters about this issue. They're both on me to try to that I should get a gun, and I'm like, I'm 60, I don't want to get a gun. But they were coming at it from the angle of the risk of my job, which is what we're talking about right now. And yeah, there's risk, but I told them, and I firmly believe this, the Wild West mentality of Louisville these days. I believe if I meet an untimely demise, it's going to be for all the reasons it's not going to be job related. It's going to be for all the reasons you see, when you check your Nextdoor app. It's going to be carjacked down at the Middletown Kroger, or did you see the picture we released on the news last night of the seafood lady gunman? And that was unbelievable. These guys up just drawn, like, I'll go back to it. This is a scary place. And so I've got my tunnel vision, or my vision wide open now, my peripheral vision wide open now at all times. And I went the longest time without ever locking my door in Louisville. But it's interesting. We used to do, I remember in the 90s, we were doing Stop the Violence primetime specials on WLKY. And that's what, like 30 years ago, And it's still bad.
I think it's changing. As he mentioned, John said he used to not even lock his doors. I grew up in a community that you didn't have to do that either. And those things are changing, not only in Louisville, but in small rural communities as well. And when I'm out at a story, when I first started my career, I never had any sense of fear for my life or fear for my safety. And you go to these things, you respond and report on some of these tragedies. In some of these instances, you have no idea what has happened. When we first arrived to Old National Bank, we had no clue what had gone on. We had heard there was a shotgun involved and police were there and these sorts of things, but none of that had been confirmed, and we knew nothing confirmed. So when you go into these situations, you can't help but have a bit of sense of fear for what you're about to step into. And as you're on your way there, something that I always try to do, whether it's that situation or responding to something else that we don't know much about, is have conversations with my crew about, okay, what are we going to do if this were to happen? Or how close do we want to get to a situation that we don't know much about? And in that communication, not only with the people who are there on the ground, but with our managers who are trusting us with the responsibility to judge whether or not something may or may not be safe. Those conversations are happening, and I think it's important to work in an environment where your bosses and the leadership in that building equip you with the things that you need to have in these situations and with the mindset that you must have when going into something that you don't know much about. And I think from my experience that we do a good job of that. And I think our crews know that they ultimately have the responsibility to decide how far to go.
There's a lot of talk of fear here, and there are people who are actually afraid to come to downtown Louisville because they're afraid. What is the responsibility of the news media to report the violence, but also report the fact that most of the time this violence is not random? That downtown Louisville is not necessarily a place you need to stay away from because you might get shot. Talk about the responsibility of reporting the violence, but at the same time, not overblowing it, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense, and I'm always shocked because I work downtown. I've worked downtown for over 20 years, and I'm amazed by people who don't ever come downtown, how terrifying they think downtown is. So we do have good relationships with the Downtown Partnership where we make sure that we are spotlighting great things that are happening in the community as well. You can't ignore the bad things, but you have to point out the good things. And, we did a story about businesses, and it's a surprising amount of businesses that have opened downtown. I do think people tend to focus on the negative. I will tell you, when I go check our website every day and I look at the numbers of what people are consuming, it tends to be the crime stories, and we have a lot of conversations in the newsroom. It's just, there was a time when there was, and this sounds awful to say, but when there was a murder, you covered every single murder. Now it happens so frequently, you can't get to all of them. Sometimes you have to do a map, and that's a terrible thing to say. When you look at the numbers, something happened, 2018 until now, the numbers have tripled in homicides. So while, yes, you have to report them, you also have to report the positive things because you don't want people to feel terrible about the place that you live. I feel a responsibility. I made a choice to make this my home 23 years ago. I love this city, and I think it's important to tell people all the good things that are happening. I can tell you, after having one of the worst days of work of my life a month ago, I've had the best 2 weeks of work seeing Derby and everybody back together and hugging and cheers and having, despite all the controversy that happened with Derby, it's a wonderful time for our city, and we have to point out those things as well.
I want to echo what Jennifer is saying in that, I've lived here for almost 5 years now. I've never experienced any sort of danger or fear downtown, really, other than maybe in a situation where I was sent to a shooting like what we saw last month. I lived in St. Matthews for a time, and I had a vehicle stolen from me there. And so I think, it's important for us not to focus on the downtown area because our TV station is here. Sometimes it can be very convenient for us to go cover a shooting that's 3 blocks away. Whereas if that same shooting had occurred in the East End somewhere, we might not have gone. Had it occurred somewhere deep in the South End, maybe we wouldn't have gone. Those conversations have to happen as well about, if we cover this, we have to also highlight these other things as well. It's not just happening in downtown, whether it be good or bad, it's happening in other parts of our city too.
Steve?
We had a shooting yesterday that we couldn't cover, so, or not a shooting, but a homicide. But I'm born and raised in Louisville, and I grew up in the Buchel Hikes Point area. And, when we came downtown, it was to go to Stewart's and sit on Santa's lap and get our picture taken. So some will remember that. But at the beginning of my career, which was in 1981, downtown Louisville was, it was not a great place to be. There were, and I tell some people about the huge number of strip joints and places like that they had, porno places. It was like, it's hard to believe, and what that had the transformation of downtown with Whiskey Row and 4th Street Live and all the hotels, boutique hotels and restaurants that are going in. I still find it hard to believe that there are people that are afraid to come downtown. But after the shooting happened, and we were asking people about it prior to Thunder, we wondered, will they have 250,000 people downtown? And there was a lot of people saying, I'm not going to go downtown. And sure enough, they ended up with a big crowd as usual. But I think it's something that we're continuing to pay attention to. And there's a lot of good news that's going on with downtown Louisville. And when those stories come across, we're going to report on them.
John, same question. Balancing covering the violence with not giving the impression that every place you go in Louisville, you might get shot.
That's an easy answer. That is, we do our jobs. We report what we know when we know it. Just report the facts, and there's no agenda on reporting more on a certain part of town. Just the facts are what they are, and we just report them.
I want to ask one last question quickly. You mentioned this, Jennifer, is that for the first time you actually have therapists, mental health counselors now for your staff. Talk about why.
It's funny. We always kind of joked around. My predecessor, the previous news director of WDRB, always said that if he wrote a book, it would be just called "Suck It Up." That's what we do. You're sick, you come to work. COVID changed that. You feel something, just shove it down. Don't talk about it. We have tough jobs. We see terrible things every day. We see wonderful things too. But we've just been in this environment where we're kind of just put it away, don't talk about it. And now as we see younger journalists get into this is not the mindset. The mindset that I grew up in, and you and John and Steve probably grew up in, is different than Dalton. People are sharing all their feelings on social media. So I was really happy. We have a policy within the station that, you do get some free therapy on an individual basis, but a lot of our people were saying, hey, I can't find anybody. There's such a backlog of trying to find therapists that I can't find anybody. So we brought a therapist into the newsroom and just kind of put a conference room off to the side and said, hey, he's going to be here, our buddy Earl, he's going to be here all day. You want to go talk to him? Go talk to him. And I was like, man, poor Earl's going to be a lonely guy all day. Nobody's going to walk in there and want to be the one who shows up. There was a wait out the door. And I think, and it's really open discussions in the newsroom too, that it's not, Earl doesn't have to be here. We can all talk about it. We're all kind of going through the same things. And it really helps to talk.
I think too that has, having a therapist there, having help there, and someone that you can talk to has also encouraged people inside the building to talk with each other and to share those experiences, the common experiences that we had that day, or in some other story that we may cover. Being able to be encouraged by being open about that and talking with it about the people and the person who you might have been on that scene with, I think really helps people get through things, and doing that and having that resource available has certainly helped facilitate some of those necessary conversations.
There are so many questions we couldn't get to, but I want you to thank these news professionals for sharing their insights with us.
And thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, panelists, for being with us today on behalf of Louisville Forum. Thank you so much. Please mark your calendars. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, June 17. We'll be announcing the program in the coming days, so please stay tuned. For more information, visit louisvilleforum.org. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hope you all have a great day.